Hey everybody, Hunter Sones here, competitive analyst at Boomi, and I'm excited to be taking you through the Objection Diffuser, a framework around how to handle objections before they derail your deal. All right, so let's get straight into it. First of all, my goal today is for you to walk away very simply with a smile on your face because work can be a lot of fun, and two, a really practical framework for taking objections and then turning them into your competitive strengths. So let's get into it. Here's the situation. You find yourself in the middle of a competitive deal. It's you, Interplay, versus one of your biggest competitors, Draft. The buyer at this point can be swayed either way, and really, this is going to come down to how your buyer interprets your differentiated value. But out of the blue, your prospect comes back and says, "We met with your competitor, Draft. They said you folks might be a little bit overkill if all we're looking for is a simple lead generation tool." So this look appears on your face. You've got to figure out how you're going to handle this. So what I'm going to walk through today is how you can put together a really simple framework in your battle cards for objection handling in these types of situations. So here are the two real reasons that you need to nail this. The first is that if you flop on this kind of objection, this could probably break your deal. So you need to make sure that that doesn't happen, first of all. The second is that if you do this properly, you can judo the heck out of this and make sure that you can turn this objection into an actual advantage for you that you can leverage for the entire duration of the rest of your deal. What not to do here is, if you get hit with an objection like this, is to stare at your Zoom camera and act like your Wi-Fi cut out like this. I've seen it happen before. You don't want that. So let's walk through how you can avoid that. The CARPQ objection handling framework. This is what we're going to walk through today. It is your ticket for turning objections into unmatched moments to let your competitive strengths shine through. So there's 5 different components to CARPQ. First is to clarify. If you get hit with a really tough objection, first you need to understand what's the question behind the question. Second, acknowledge. You need to recognize that there are some legitimate differences here that you can then point out and use to your advantage later on. Third, reframe. This is probably the most important component of the CARPQ framework. It's where you offer some type of new lens around this competitive difference, and you frame it as one of your advantages rather than a disadvantage. Next is proof. You have to be able to back up some of your points around your new reframing. So this is going to be a really critical way that you do that. And then last is a question, asking a really light discovery question to turn things back into your favor. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to walk you through all 5 components of CARPQ so that you can incorporate these into your battle cards and essentially turn your competitive objections into strengths for yourself. So I'll go through what examples of each of these look like as well. But first, I really want to quickly touch on when you should use this and when you shouldn't. So when you should use this is if the objection is a matter of reframing. So if you can take something that might be seen as maybe a disadvantage, and then you can shift it around to turn this into something that might be a bit more advantageous for you. When not to use this type of framework is essentially if you have an objection that comes up that is really, oh, we have that capability, or we don't have that capability. Or if you really feel like this prospect is probably not going to be a good fit for what you're able to deliver, if their needs just aren't aligned to your solution, then probably don't use this. But if you do fall into that upper category where this objection can be more of a matter of framing, then this is going to be a really killer solution for you. Okay, so let's get into it. Step 1, clarify. So if you get hit with that objection around this solution might be overkill, I'm not totally sure anymore, the first thing that you want to do is not get defensive. You want to get curious. You want to identify where this objection is coming from, and you want to let the prospect do as much of the talking as possible. So the real goal here is to ask a question that's going to get to the root of the concern around this. You might actually have to spend a few minutes on this. You don't want to do this lightly. You really want to try and understand where the prospect is coming from. So an example of this could be, hey, that's fair. I'd be curious to learn a little bit more. Did they mention anything in particular about the product that might come across as overkill? And yeah, again, spend a few minutes here trying to understand where they're coming from, why this is maybe showing up as a concern as opposed to something that they might have handled themselves. Now, moving on to step 2. This is really critical for setting yourself up for the rest of this process. Simple, but very important. It's to acknowledge that there are some differences and to validate what they're feeling. So essentially, you want to confidently recognize that there are legitimate differences between you and your competitor's approach here and call them out. So an example of this could be, hey, I'm glad that this came up actually. There are some key differences between our approaches that are worth exploring deeper. Now, the reason that you want to acknowledge that there are differences is because if you try and brush this off and say, hey, there are no differences, really, this is something that you don't want to pay attention to, it doesn't give you the opportunity to then turn this into your own strength. If there's nothing there, you can't turn it into a strength. But if you call out that there are actual distinct differences between you and your competitor's product, it sets you up perfectly to talk about how that isn't necessarily a limitation of yours. It's actually an advantage. So this is where we get to step 3, reframe. This is, again, the most critical part of the CARPQ framework. It's to offer a new lens on this difference between you and your competitor's product. It's to subtly point out your competitor's limitations that might not have been brought up, and then to tie this back to the customer goals. So this one is a little bit more complex in terms of the example, but bear with me here. What you might say is, what we've seen is customers who start with lead gen often outgrow it fairly quickly. Interplay, us, lets you scale easily. So when customer onboarding becomes a priority, you're not stuck switching platforms to adopt to your new use cases. Now, based on what you've mentioned around your growth plans for this year, that flexibility to expand use cases might come in handy sooner rather than later to achieve XYZ goal. So this is essentially what this could look like. Now, breaking this down a little bit more, this is only going to work if you've done proper discovery, if you actually understand what your prospects' goals are and what some of their challenges might be if they went with the competitor solution. And you can also notice that there's 3 different components to this. There's first, you're offering a new lens. Hey, before we get too deep into this, it's worth considering XYZ. You're pointing out a limitation and also how this is your advantage. And then 3, most importantly, you're tying this back to their goals. You're not just saying there's an obscure difference between us and our competitor. No, you're actually pointing out how your differentiated value helps them achieve their goals that you've already talked about in discovery. Now, what you're going to see as another part of today's sessions is around value wedges. And this is a really critical place where value wedges come to play. Okay, so moving on to step 4, proof. So once you've gone through the initial steps of clarifying, acknowledging that there are some differences, reframing, you actually need to back this up. You can't just make claims that don't have any basis in reality. So what you need to do is actually point out that you shouldn't just take my word for it, and then share some type of stat or quote or a story or some type of evidence that'll help you back this point up. So in essence, you could say something like, in fact, you wouldn't be alone. Over 100 customers have switched to us from other point solutions because of this exact challenge with expanding use cases. So this really helps validate that it's not just this one customer in this particular situation. This is a common difference or a common advantage that's seen by, in this case, 100 customers. Okay, and then last is a question. So this part is also really important so that you're not just monologuing for a few minutes, asking a couple discovery questions, and then leaving it. You actually want to turn this back into a deeper discussion around how this new framing is landing. So 3 things you want to do here. You want to gauge the new framing. You want to diffuse the situation a little bit more. And then last, you probably want this to be setting you up for a longer conversation. You don't just want to leave it here. This is how you start the conversation, but it's not necessarily how you end it. So an example here would be, realistically, there are advantages to each approach. Curious where you're leaning. And most importantly, to add, the reason that I ask is because I've seen buyers go either way. This is really important for diffusing. You don't want to come across as super defensive or anything like that. You really want your buyer to to feel, and ideally this is the case, that you have their best interests in mind. Of course, there are advantages to going either way, but you want to understand where they're leaning after understanding this new reframing. And you might need to dig a little bit deeper. You might have to reapproach the reframe a little bit later on. But this is essentially how you can wrap up this component of CARPQ. Okay, so what did we just go through? We talked through how when you get hit with an objection that requires some reframing, you can use the CARPQ framework, which consists of clarifying, understanding the question that's behind the question. 2, acknowledge, which is recognizing that there are legitimate differences. 3, reframing by offering a new lens and framing this objection actually as an advantage. 4th, using proof to actually back up your claims with evidence. And last is asking a light discovery question that turns things back in your favor. So how can you apply this today? Well, the first thing is add this to your battle cards. You can use this CARPQ framework in any of your battle cards in the objection section. I might recommend this for maybe your top 2 or 3 most common objections. You don't need to use it for every single one. It is a pretty hefty framework, but maybe for the top 2 or 3. Second, you probably want to get some feedback from your reps. Make sure that this is framed in language that they would actually use. And 3 is iterate early and often. Listen to gong calls, understand if there's anything else that maybe you can learn from how this is playing out in the field, and then iterate your competitive content as needed. I would also add here that reps are starting to access things through Ask Klue as opposed to just going to battle cards. So ensuring that you have this type of framework pervasive throughout your battle cards, Ask Klue will be able to pick that up and feed them even better recommended content based on their queries. So that'll be really critical as well. And that's that. That is the CARPQ framework in essence. Excited to answer any of your questions in our Q&A segment coming up in a few moments here. Thank you very much.